On the evening of December 6, 1941, in a modest dance hall near Pearl Harbor's naval base in Honolulu, a young Navy ensign named William Crawford held a local schoolteacher named Leilani Kamaka in his arms as they swayed to Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade, both of them laughing at something trivial, both completely unaware that in less than 12 hours, Japanese bombs would rain down on the harbor and obliterate everything they knew. They'd met just 3 weeks earlier at a friend's beach party, had spent every possible moment together since, and that December night had been meant to be their last date before William's ship, the USS Arizona, departed for routine maneuvers in the Pacific. William had been working up the courage all evening to tell Leilani something important, to make plans that extended beyond his upcoming deployment, to admit that in just 3 weeks she'd become the most important person in his world. But the song ended before he could say the words, and Leilani had to leave early to help her mother prepare for Sunday church services. They'd parted with a promise to meet again after his ship returned, with a kiss that felt like a beginning rather than an ending, with no way of knowing that sunrise would bring devastation that would separate them not for weeks, but for eternity. This is their story. Two people who danced once before the bombs fell, whose love was interrupted by the attack that thrust America into World War II, whose connection was severed by fate and circumstance in ways neither could have imagined, proving that sometimes the cruelest thing war does isn't kill love, but leave it forever suspended in that moment before everything changed, forever wondering what might have been. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more untold wartime love stories about connections severed by history's darkest moments. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? William Crawford was 23 years old in December 1941, a naval ensign who'd graduated from the Naval Academy at Annapolis just 6 months earlier. He came from a Navy family. His father had served in World War I. His older brother was a submarine officer, and William had grown up with salt water in his veins and a clear understanding that he'd follow the family tradition into military service. He'd been assigned to the USS Arizona as a junior gunnery officer in June 1941, had quickly proven himself competent and reliable, and had settled into the routine of peacetime naval service in Hawaii. Life on the Arizona was good in late 1941. The battleship was one of the most powerful vessels in the Pacific Fleet, and while international tensions were escalating, particularly with Japan, most sailors believed that any conflict would remain distant and abstract. Hawaii was paradise, duty was light, and William and his fellow officers spent their shore leave enjoying everything the islands offered. It was at a beach party in mid-November 1941 that William first met Leilani Kamaka. She'd been there with friends, teaching at an elementary school in Honolulu, a local girl born and raised on Oahu, whose family had deep roots in Hawaiian culture. Leilani was 22, intelligent and spirited, with a laugh that made everyone around her smile and a grace that came from growing up surrounded by the ocean and the unique blend of cultures that made Hawaii special. William had noticed her immediately, noticed the way she moved with natural confidence, the way she engaged everyone in conversation, the way her presence seemed to light up the gathering. He'd worked up the courage to introduce himself, and they'd talked for hours that first evening, discovering unexpected connections despite their different backgrounds. Leilani had been intrigued by this mainland Navy officer who seemed genuinely interested in Hawaiian culture, rather than just treating the islands as an exotic assignment. William had been captivated by Leilani's intelligence, her passion for teaching, her deep connection to her heritage, and the way she challenged his assumptions about the world. Over the following 3 weeks, William and Leilani had seen each other whenever William's duty schedule permitted. They'd walked on beaches, explored Honolulu, talked about everything from family to dreams for the future. William had introduced Leilani to his shipmates, who'd teased him mercilessly about being smitten. Leilani had introduced William to her family, her mother, father, and 2 younger sisters, who'd been cautiously welcoming of the Navy officer courting their daughter. By early December, William knew he was in love. It had happened fast, too fast by conventional standards, but there was something about Leilani that felt right, in ways he couldn't fully articulate. She was his counterbalance, grounding him when Navy life became too rigid, challenging him to think beyond just duty and service. And Leilani, despite her initial reservations about dating a military man whose service could take him anywhere at any time, found herself falling for William. He was kind, genuinely curious about her world, treated her as an intellectual equal rather than just a pretty girl to pass time with during shore leave. On December 6th, William had finally decided to be honest about his feelings. The Arizona was scheduled to depart on Monday for what was supposed to be a brief training exercise, and William wanted to make plans that extended beyond just dating casually whenever he was in port. He wanted to talk about a future, tentative, uncertain given his naval career, but real nonetheless. They'd met at the dance hall that Saturday evening, one of the popular spots where Navy personnel and locals mixed, where big band music played and couples danced under strings of lights. William had held Leilani close during Moonlight Serenade, searching for the right words to express what he felt, but the courage that served him well in his naval duties seemed to fail him in matters of the heart. The song had ended too quickly. Leilani had apologized. She needed to get home to help prepare for Sunday services at her family's church. William had walked her to the bus stop, had kissed her goodnight, had promised they'd have dinner on Tuesday after the Arizona returned from maneuvers. "I have something important to tell you then," William had said, still not quite brave enough to say the words, but wanting Leilani to know that something significant was coming. "Important good or important bad?" Leilani had asked with a smile. "Important good," William had assured her. "Very good. Just wait for me. We'll talk on Tuesday. I'll be waiting," Leilani had promised, kissing him once more before boarding the bus that would take her home. William had walked back toward the harbor, feeling lighter than he had in months, already composing in his mind what he'd say on Tuesday, how he'd finally tell Leilani that he loved her and wanted to build something real despite the uncertainties of naval service and a world sliding toward war. He'd returned to the Arizona around midnight, checked in with the duty officer, and retired to his quarters. Most of the crew was ashore. Saturday night liberty meant the ship was minimally manned. William had fallen asleep thinking about Leilani, about Tuesday's dinner, about the future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities. Sunrise brought devastation that destroyed everything. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor began at 7:48 a.m. on Sunday, December 7, 1941. The first wave of bombers struck with complete surprise, catching the Pacific Fleet at anchor, crews at minimal readiness, defenses utterly unprepared. Within minutes, the harbor became an inferno. The USS Arizona was moored at Battleship Row, outboard of the repair ship Vestal. At approximately 8:10 a.m., a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb dropped by a Japanese bomber penetrated the Arizona's forward magazine, causing a catastrophic explosion that destroyed the ship's forward section and killed 1,177 officers and crew in an instant. William Crawford was in his quarters when the first explosions began. He'd rushed topside, trying to reach his battle station, moving through chaos as bombs fell and the ship shuddered from impacts. He'd been on the main deck, heading forward, when the magazine exploded. The blast threw William overboard, unconscious from the concussion, his body pulled under by the suction of the sinking ship. He should have died. Most men near the explosion did. But somehow, through luck or fate, William was blown clear of the wreckage, surfaced unconscious but alive, and was pulled from the burning water by sailors from a rescue boat. William was evacuated to the hospital, suffering from severe concussion, burns, and injuries from debris. He drifted in and out of consciousness for days, occasionally lucid enough to ask about his ship and crew, but mostly lost in fever dreams and morphine haze. The Arizona had sunk in less than 9 minutes, taking 1,177 men to the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Only 335 crew members survived, most of them having been. Leilani had been at church with her family when the attack began. They'd heard the explosions, seen planes overhead. Initially thought it was some kind of drill despite the Sunday morning timing. When the truth became clear, that Pearl Harbor was under attack, that America was suddenly at war, Leilani's first thought had been of William. The Arizona. William was on the Arizona. Was the ship in harbor? Had it left already for maneuvers? Was William safe? The hours following the attack were chaos. Communications were disrupted, casualty information was spotty, and civilians were kept away from the military areas. Leilani tried desperately to get information about the Arizona, about William, about whether he'd survived. But information was impossible to get. The military was overwhelmed, focused on defending against possible follow-up attacks, unable to provide detailed casualty lists to civilians. It took 3 days before Leilani confirmed that the Arizona had been destroyed, that more than 1,000 men had died, that the ship was a total loss. But she couldn't confirm whether William was among the dead or the survivors. His name wasn't on the published lists of confirmed dead, but it also wasn't on the lists of known survivors. He was simply missing, possibly dead, possibly injured, possibly evacuated somewhere she couldn't reach. Leilani tried everything. She contacted the Navy, wrote letters, called hospitals, asked William's friends from the ship for information. But in the chaos of the attack's aftermath, with thousands of casualties, with America suddenly at war, with military operations transforming Hawaii into a fortress, individual inquiries got lost in the massive confusion. For weeks, Leilani existed in agonizing uncertainty. William might be dead, blown apart in the Arizona's magazine explosion, or he might be alive, wounded somewhere, unable to contact her. She had no way of knowing, and the not knowing was torture. By January 1942, as the initial chaos settled and casualty lists became more complete, William's name appeared on a list of survivors, critically wounded, evacuated to California for long-term medical treatment. Leilani felt overwhelming relief. He was alive. Wounded, but alive. She immediately tried to contact him, writing letters to the military hospital in San Diego, where the list indicated he'd been transferred. But her letters went unanswered. She didn't know if they were reaching him, if he was too injured to respond, if something had gone wrong. What Leilani didn't know, couldn't know, was that William had been evacuated in a near-comatose state, that he'd spent weeks in critical condition, that his personal effects had been lost in the chaos, and that he had no way of contacting her even if he'd been conscious enough to try. William finally regained full consciousness in mid-January 1942, nearly 6 weeks after the attack. He was in a military hospital in San Diego, surrounded by other Pearl Harbor survivors, slowly piecing together what had happened. The Arizona was gone. His shipmates were dead. America was at war, and he'd somehow survived when so many hadn't. His first coherent thought, when he fully understood his situation, was of Leilani. He needed to contact her, needed to let her know he was alive, needed to keep the promise he'd made to meet her on Tuesday, a promise now impossibly broken by death and destruction and continental distance. William tried to write letters, but his hands were bandaged from burns, and his injuries made writing difficult. He asked nurses to help, but the hospital was overwhelmed with casualties, and personal correspondence took a back seat to medical treatment. He didn't know Leilani's address by heart. It had been in his personal effects, which had been lost when the Arizona sank, and he couldn't remember her phone number clearly through the haze of injury and medication. William knew she lived in Honolulu, knew her father's name, knew she taught at an elementary school. But that information wasn't enough to locate one person in a city that had been transformed by martial law and military occupation. The Hawaii he'd known in December 1941 no longer existed. Everything had changed in 2 hours of bombing on a Sunday morning. By February 1942, William had recovered enough to be interviewed by Navy investigators documenting the attack. He'd been promoted to lieutenant junior grade, had been awarded the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and had been told he'd be reassigned to new duties once he was medically cleared. The Navy needed experienced officers, even young ones, and William's survival made him valuable despite his injuries. But all William cared about was finding Leilani. He continued trying to send letters to Hawaii, addressing them to Leilani Kamaka, schoolteacher, Honolulu, hoping that somehow the military postal service could locate her. He didn't know if the letters were getting through, didn't know if Leilani was even receiving them, didn't know if she thought he was dead or alive. In March 1942, William was reassigned to anti-submarine warfare training in San Diego, preparing for new duties, hunting German U-boats in the Atlantic. The Navy was moving fast, rebuilding after Pearl Harbor, and William was caught up in the urgent need to train new crews and establish new operations. He was given 2 weeks' leave before his new assignment, and he used every day trying to find information about Leilani. He contacted the territorial government in Hawaii, asking for help locating a civilian. But Hawaii was under martial law, communications were restricted, and civilian inquiries were low priority. He was told repeatedly that locating one person among hundreds of thousands was impossible given current conditions, that he should focus on his military duties, that personal matters would have to wait until after the war. William had no choice but to accept that reality. He was a naval officer at war. His duty was to serve. Personal happiness would have to wait. But he never stopped thinking about Leilani, never stopped hoping that somehow, eventually, he'd find her again and explain why he hadn't kept his promise, why Tuesday's dinner had never happened, why everything had changed in the space between a Saturday night dance and Sunday morning destruction. Leilani, meanwhile, had received none of William's letters. The military postal service in early 1942 was chaotic, and letters addressed only to Leilani Kamaka, schoolteacher, Honolulu, had no way of reaching her without a proper address. They were likely lost, misfiled, or simply never delivered in the confusion of a territory under martial law. By spring 1942, Leilani had resigned herself to a painful reality. William was alive according to the casualty lists, but he either couldn't contact her or had chosen not to. The latter possibility hurt worst of all. Perhaps William had decided that their brief romance wasn't worth maintaining from the mainland. Perhaps his injuries had changed him. Perhaps he'd moved on with someone else. Perhaps the attack had made him realize that wartime relationships were too complicated. Leilani tried to move on with her life. She continued teaching, though the war had transformed her classroom, students dealing with trauma from the attack, Japanese-American families facing increasing suspicion and eventual internment, the constant military presence that had turned Hawaii into a fortress. Everything had changed, and Leilani changed with it. She dated occasionally. Other military men stationed in Hawaii. Local men who'd known her before the war. But nothing felt right. Every dance reminded her of that December night with William. Every man she met was measured against the Navy ensign she'd known for just 3 weeks, but had fallen for completely. By late 1942, nearly a year after the attack, Leilani had accepted that she'd probably never see William again. Whatever they'd had, whatever they might have had, was lost to history. Another casualty of Pearl Harbor that wouldn't appear on any official lists. William, meanwhile, was hunting U-boats in the Atlantic, had been promoted to lieutenant, had distinguished himself in anti-submarine operations. He'd survived depth charge attacks, had helped sink German submarines, had proven himself as an effective officer. But he carried Hawaii with him constantly. The memory of that last dance, the promise he'd made, the future he'd been about to propose before bombs fell and destroyed everything. He'd tried repeatedly over the years to get information about Leilani, had written letters during brief shore leaves, had asked anyone with Hawaii connections if they knew anything. But the trail was always cold. Leilani was somewhere in Hawaii, presumably alive, presumably having moved on with her life. William had no way to contact her, no way to explain, no way to reclaim what had been lost. The war ground on through 1943 and 1944. William transferred to the Pacific Theater in mid-1944, assigned to a destroyer supporting operations in the Philippines. He returned to Pacific waters for the first time since Pearl Harbor, operating relatively close to Hawaii but never close enough to get leave there, never in a position to search for Leilani personally. Area Hospital for Recovery, and by cruel coincidence or fate's design, he was evacuated to a military hospital in Hawaii. Not Pearl Harbor. The Navy had moved most medical facilities away from the still vulnerable harbor, but to a hospital in Honolulu, just miles from where Leilani lived and worked. William arrived in late November 1944, nearly 3 years after the attack, wounded but not critically, expected to recover fully within weeks. As soon as he was ambulatory, he began searching for Leilani in person. He visited schools, asking for a teacher named Leilani Kamaka. He checked territorial records when possible. He asked locals in Honolulu if they knew the Kamaka family. And finally, after 3 years of failed attempts and lost letters and impossible distance, William got information. A principal at an elementary school remembered Leilani Kamaka. She'd taught there until mid-1943, then had married and moved to California with her husband, a Marine officer she'd met in 1942. The information hit William like a physical blow. Leilani was married, had moved away, had built a life with someone else, while William had been searching for her, carrying her memory through anti-submarine warfare and kamikaze attacks, and 3 years of hoping. Leilani had done what William himself had told her to do. She'd moved on. William couldn't blame her. They'd known each other for 3 weeks. He'd disappeared after Pearl Harbor with no explanation. She'd probably thought he was dead, or that he'd abandoned her, or that their brief connection wasn't worth maintaining. Of course she'd moved on. Of course she'd met someone else. Of course she'd built a new life. But knowing that intellectually didn't make it hurt less. William had survived Pearl Harbor, had survived 3 years of war, sustained by memories of 3 weeks in November 1941 and 1 dance on December 6th. And it had all been for nothing. The woman he'd loved had married someone else, and the future he'd imagined had never existed except in his mind. What William didn't know, couldn't know, was that Leilani's marriage had been a mistake born from loneliness and the pressure of wartime. She'd met Lieutenant James Sullivan, a Marine officer, in early 1942. James had been kind, attentive, offered stability in a world that had become terrifyingly unstable. Leilani's family had encouraged the match. James was a good man, a decorated officer, someone who could provide for her. And Leilani, convinced that William was either dead or had chosen not to contact her, had eventually accepted James's proposal. They'd married in mid-1943 and moved to California when James was reassigned. But the marriage had been wrong from the start. Leilani had tried to make it work, tried to love James the way he deserved, but her heart had never fully belonged to him. She still thought about William constantly, still remembered that December night, still wondered what had happened and why he'd never contacted her. By late 1944, Leilani's marriage was failing. She and James had separated, not divorced yet, as wartime made such things complicated, but living apart, both acknowledging that the marriage had been a mistake. James had been reassigned to the Pacific, and Leilani had been planning to return to Hawaii, to her family, to try to rebuild her life yet again. But William didn't know any of this. All he knew was that Leilani was married, had moved to California, had built a life that didn't include him. And with that knowledge, William finally accepted what he'd been fighting against for 3 years. He needed to let go, needed to stop searching, needed to accept that what he'd had with Leilani was a beautiful moment in time that couldn't survive the reality of war. William was discharged from the hospital in December 1944, returned to duty, and continued serving through the war's end. He survived, was promoted to lieutenant commander, received multiple decorations for his service. When the war finally ended in August 1945, William stayed in the Navy, making it his career, never marrying, carrying always the memory of 3 weeks in November 1941 and one dance before the bombs fell. Leilani returned to Hawaii in early 1945, finalized her divorce from James, resumed teaching. She lived quietly, never remarried, carried her own memories of those 3 weeks with William, and the future that had been promised on December 6th, but destroyed. On December 7th, neither William nor Leilani knew how close. They'd come to finding each other in November 1944. William had searched for her while Leilani was already separated from her husband, already planning to return to Hawaii, already emotionally free. But timing, which had destroyed their relationship on December 7th, 1941, destroyed it again in November 1944, with just a few weeks separating William's search from Leilani's availability. They never saw each other again. Both lived long lives, William retiring from the Navy as a captain, Leilani teaching for 40 years in Honolulu. Both remained unmarried. Both carried memories of what might have been. Both wondered occasionally what had happened to the other person they'd danced with one Saturday night. In December 1941, William Crawford died in 2001, at age 83. Among his effects was a photograph of the USS Arizona before the attack, a Purple Heart medal, and a dance card from a Honolulu dance hall dated December 6, 1941, with Leilani written across it in faded ink. Leilani Kamaka died in 2009 at age 90. Among her effects was a pressed flower William had given her in November 1941, a newspaper clipping about Pearl Harbor survivors that mentioned William's name, and a journal entry from December 7, 1941. Something terrible has happened. The harbor was attacked. William's ship, the Arizona, I don't know if he's alive. I was supposed to wait for him. He said Tuesday. He had something important to tell me. Now I don't know if I'll ever see him again. Please, God, let him be alive. Whatever happens, wherever he is, let him be alive. The story of William Crawford and Leilani Kamaka represents one of war's cruelest legacies. Not the people it kills, but the futures it destroys, the connections it severs, the possibilities it eliminates before they can fully form. William and Leilani had known each other for 3 weeks. By any conventional measure, their relationship was barely begun, certainly not serious enough to withstand years of separation and failed communication. But love doesn't follow conventional measures. Sometimes 3 weeks is enough to recognize something profound. Sometimes one dance is enough to change your life. Sometimes a promise made on December 6th can sustain you through 3 years of war, even when December 7th destroys any possibility of keeping that promise. What makes their story particularly tragic is how close they came to finding each other. If William's letters had reached Leilani in early 1942, if Leilani's attempts to contact William had succeeded, if William had searched for Leilani just a few weeks earlier in late 1944, any of these timing changes could have resulted in reunion rather than permanent separation. But timing in war is everything, and their timing was consistently wrong. They danced once before the bombs fell, and then fate separated them forever. Not through death, but through the more subtle cruelties of failed communication, impossible distance, and the chaos that makes finding one specific person in a world at war nearly impossible. They danced once before the bombs fell, Then fate separated them forever. It's a story about love interrupted at its very beginning, about promises that circumstances made impossible to keep, about two people who carried each other through decades without ever seeing each other again. They both survived the war physically, but in a very real sense, part of both of them died on December 7th, 1941. The part that believed in the future they'd been about to build together. The part that trusted timing and fate. The part that hadn't yet learned that sometimes the cruelest thing war does is leave you alive to mourn what might have been. But this wasn't the only love story interrupted by Pearl Harbor's devastation. In our next